This is Donna with More Than a Review, and I'm excited. We're here today with Ed, and he has just a fabulous background and has led to writing a novel. So I'm curious to see like how your past has kind of led to writing novels, because it doesn't sound like that's where you were headed in the beginning.
No, my last few books were all nonfiction, military history, and I have a military background, so writing historical fiction with a military setting sort of comes natural. In fact, one of my nonfiction books is about the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943, and that's where this book is set. So I really gave myself more latitude in fiction.
Yeah.
For the nonfiction books, I interviewed probably 100 veterans of the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, so I have real-time stories from them, read a lot of first-person accounts, memoirs, all those things. And by jumping over to fiction, I just had the latitude to capture some of those stories, add things, composite characters, and at the same time write about something that I find fascinating and stories that people find fascinating, especially with the 75th anniversary of the end of the war coming up.
Yeah. So when you went to West Point, like, did you ever think you'd be a writer?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to be a soldier, I wanted to be a writer. And so I've gotten to do both of those things. Wow. I spent 11 years in the Army, did all the things that I wanted to accomplish. And then I had an opportunity when I was still in the Army. My first book was published then. And it was a sort of transition point in my career. And so I had a book contract when I left the service, and so it worked out, yeah.
It seems like the Army's very physical and demanding, and then writing seems more sedentary. Like, how does that like transition?
Yeah, the biggest contrast is actually being in the military is very social, and writing is very solitary.
Okay.
Yes, being in the Army is an outdoor sport, General Petraeus like to say. That's true, but I can still do all that stuff. But it's the solitary nature versus, I had command of a company of 140 soldiers. That was just being surrounded by people all the time. So suddenly I'm just there in my study. So I have to make a concerted effort to get out there and meet people and do all that, because I'm an extrovert by nature. So I need that.
Yeah.
My wife comes home after being with people all day. She just wants to be quiet, and I've been by myself all day, and I'm just ready to talk. So,
yeah. Oh yeah, that's great. So tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah. So Blame the Dead is set in Sicily in 1943. This is right in the wake of the Allied invasion, which the D-Day was July 10th, 1943. So the area behind the lines is just complete chaos. You have giant traffic jams of equipment trying to move to the front. You have a flood of wounded coming back to these field hospitals, which are just giant tent cities that follow along behind the battle lines to treat wounded soldiers. In one of those places, you have surgeons and nurses doing amazing things under conditions of heat and dirt and threat of enemy action, and constantly having to move forward. In the novel, one of those surgeons gets murdered, and a first lieutenant military police officer who's a former Philadelphia beat cop, never been a detective, but he's the first guy on the scene, and it falls to him to figure out what happened. It doesn't help that it turns out the victim was not a very nice person, and the thing that Eddie Harkins is the protagonist, the thing he hears most often is he got what he was coming to him. Got what was coming to him, but of course you can't blame the dead guy for getting himself killed. So yeah, so he's got to sort things out. He's in way over his head too.
So do you have anything coming next?
I do. This is the first in a series I'm calling Victory in Europe, and in the second book, which I've spent revising over the summer, same protagonist, at least one other of the supporting characters, but he finds himself in London on the eve of the Allied invasion of France, which was this giant coiled spring of Allied energy waiting, and everybody's waiting. We know it's going to happen, we just don't know when and exactly where, and we hope the Germans don't figure it out. So he gets caught up in that. There's a murder, but it has implications for both whether D-Day is going to be successful or not, and implications really for U.S. and Soviet relations after the war. So he's in even a deeper pool. He's more tired, more frustrated, and not really much more experience. So it's a big challenge for him. But I had a great time writing about London in 1944.
So did you go over there? Or?
I have been over there, and I like to go to the place because it's if you really want to capture what it feels like, if it's at all possible for you to go to a place. I visited Sicily when I was writing my nonfiction book. My daughter was a teenager at the time. She and I traipsed all around just to sort of get the feel for what things look like and feel like and smell like. and I think that's important. Yeah.
Yeah. So, talking about this book, or even the one you're editing now, have you had to edit out anything?
Yeah, yeah. So in 1943, there's a lot of casual racism and sexism, and I say casual advisedly. It suffused everything. So I don't want my character to be a jerk, but at the same time, that's the world he grew up in. So with things like, does he call women girls? Does he think, when somebody says a woman wants to be a doctor, does he just think that's crazy? Or even women, the Army nurses in a combat zone, and all the things that they're called upon to do, and how he reacts to that. I don't want him to be a jerk, but he also can't be, some woke character who gets dropped in from a more enlightened time, because that probably wouldn't be. So I gave him a bunch of sisters, and he's always thinking about his sisters, and he was always protective of them. And so I think that helped me walk that balance. Yeah.
I was going to say that must be an interesting balance of being true to the time period.
Yes.
But then being sensitive to someone reading it in this time period.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And there are strong women characters in the book too. My class at West Point was the first class with women, so I like to say I've been surrounded by strong, forceful, smart women, since my whole adult life. So that part wasn't as huge of a stretch for me, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. So what's an early experience that has shaped your writing?
So when I was, my last assignment in the Army was teaching English at West Point, teaching writing. So think freshman composition, but with uniforms. And so the new instructors in the summer, we had to write all of the essays the cadets were going to have to write during the term, hand them into this grizzled old colonel who was the course director, PhD professor, Vietnam veteran, and he kept making me rewrite mine. And I thought mine was at least as good as my peers, but so eventually I got the nerve to ask him what was going on. So you picture I'm standing in front of his desk, at parade rest, because it's still the Army, and he looks up at me and he says, you probably turned in all first drafts of your papers in school, didn't you? And he said, and you probably got good grades. And it really wasn't a question, so I just kept my mouth shut. And he said, I think you probably have some talent, but you're just coasting, Captain. Oh. He said, writing is like, playing the piano or playing second base. You got to break it down. You got to work at it. You got to practice. You got to push yourself to be better. And he says, if you try that, you might go someplace. And then he threw the paper. He goes, write it again. So yeah, so that was a huge, that was a big epiphany for me. And he's right. You gotta go every sentence, every paragraph. It can't just be something you toss off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is amazing that you would get that and then become a writer and probably be thinking that as you have to go back through and.
Yeah, well, it keeps me honest. It was external motivation, but it was what I needed at the time. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to new authors that are just getting started or wanting to get started?
Yeah, I talk to aspiring authors often. They'll contact me, which is great because that's how I got my start. You gotta read, you gotta write, and you gotta persevere. So you have to be an active reader. When you read something that you think is great, you have to parse it and figure out why. So one of my favorite historians writing today is Rick Atkinson. I mean, his prose is so beautiful, you just want to read it out loud. So when I run across a passage like that, I look at it and say, okay, well, what did he do? What verbs did he use? What sentence structure? How did he vary the lengths of the paragraphs and the sentences? You really have to pull it apart, and you have to care. So Ken Follett, the very successful author, he said, a writer is somebody who knows and cares about the difference between saying somebody is eager and somebody is anxious. So you have to be kind of nerdy about that. So you got to read and you got to practice. And it is, as the colonel told me, it's like playing a musical instrument. You got to get in there and practice. The more you do it, but you can also write in different genres. You can write in imitation of other authors, just to kind of stretch your muscles a little bit. But you absolutely have to keep at it. And then you got to persevere. I read a story recently about a young woman who went to her defend her dissertation wearing a skirt made out of all the rejection letters. Did you see that? From all the professional journals that had turned her down. And she's like, I know I'm good. And I was like, that's awesome. And every author has stories about authors who got turned down. Mario Puzo got turned down by 20-some publishers. Yeah. Who wants to read about the mafia? Turned out a lot of people did. My wife and I were in Nashville recently, and we heard a story about Dolly Parton when she was an aspiring songwriter. just waiting for a break, Elvis Presley calls her and says, I want to record your song, I Will Always Love You. Well, this is like a bolt from heaven, right? But then his manager calls and says, but we're going to take all the royalties. And she's like, no, you can't. So she said she cried for weeks, but she turned him down. But she stuck to her guns and her business plan, you know, and she had the last laugh, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I won't even get started on Colonel Parker. I'm a huge Elvis fan.
Colonel Parker, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I always say if I'd married him, he'd still be alive, but anyway. So what would the character in your book say about you?
Yeah. So my dad and two of my brothers were enlisted men in the service, and Eddie Harkins is a little suspicious of regulars, of professionals. So I was a career person. And turns out my brothers were as well. One of my brothers told me I was the black sheep of the family. Eddie Harkins respects them, but he doesn't quite understand why somebody would be in the military for one day longer than you had to be, than you were forced to be, even though he's a citizen soldier and he volunteered. So I think Eddie Harkins would have laughed at my brother's joke that I was the black sheep because I'd become an officer. I was a real letdown, apparently, to my family.
So tell us, why would somebody want to read your book?
Yeah, so this is historical fiction, but you absolutely don't need to be a history geek to read it. It's a timeless story because you have men and women, and I hope they're characters that the reader cares about, trying to do good things under terrible circumstances. Eddie Harkins is investigating the murder of a not very nice person, but he's trying to carve a little bit of justice, maybe, out of this awful situation. He feels a little ridiculous because a few miles away, men are getting killed, good men are getting killed every day, and yet he's trying to do right because he's a lawman, as he says. And so that's kind of a timeless story, trying to wrestle something right out of a terrible situation. It just so happens it takes place in a combat zone of World War II.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes.
We'll have links to the book, so you'll be able to check it out into his website. Thanks for joining us.